So I'm glad to Bene. Arthur Freeman. I'm glad to introduce him at the Sigmund Freud University. We are doing this series of lectures about cognitive and non-cognitive therapy in future presentations. This presentation, after we had David Clark 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, who spoke about the birth of the British development of cognitive therapy. Now we have, before, the American root of the cognitive behavior therapy by Aaron Beck. Arthur Freeman is one of his main cooperators. He wrote a seminal book about the application of cognitive therapy to personality disorders. So he knows Aaron T. Beck from, I think from the beginning. I don't know, he will tell us. But today he will speak about the psychoanalytic roots of cognitive behavior therapy. So Arthur Freeman, let's start.
Okay. Let's go to the first slide. I want to thank you for this opportunity to invite me video to your university and to present my work and ideas to my friends, to Giovanni and his colleagues. I want to thank them for organizing this talk. Next. So rather than trying to copy the slides, if you write to me at that email address, I'll be glad to send you a copy of the PowerPoint. So you will have that from me. Next. I must tell you that this has been a wonderful learning experience for me, because I think maybe in a very American way, we think we've invented everything. And when I began to prepare for today's lecture, I was astounded, impressed by the very powerful Italian roots of CBT. I was impressed by the Italian psychoanalytic work, that generally when we think of psychoanalytic work, we think of the Austrians, we think of Freud, we think of Hungarians. But as I began to read the Italian psychoanalysts, I was impressed by the broad depth of contribution made by Italian psychoanalysts. So this has been a great learning experience for me. Next. Basically, I had little exposure to the very comprehensive Italian psychoanalytic tradition. Next. So I found a superb volume, Reading Italian Psychoanalysis, and found work that was unknown to me because my own training in psychoanalytic work has been much more in the Viennese tradition, that the work on dreams, transference, countertransference, and the analytic dialogue were really very enlightening for me. Here you had already said it, and then it seems that your Italian ideas were stolen by others. So in America, we know very little of the Italian tradition. The names were all foreign to me. And the more I read, the more interested I became. And I believe that any good psychoanalytic training program must include a strong Italian influence, because many of the ideas that were developed by the Italian psychoanalysts have been taken over, and I know in my training we didn't discuss any of it. So this is a chance for me to do that. Next. Now, what has been a great influence in the Italian thinking has been a constructivist approach. The constructivist work of the late Michael Mahoney, Vittorio Gaetano, Johnny Leotti. And it seems so obvious that the constructivist approach, the idea that each of us constructs our own understanding, our own reality, it is so obvious that it's hard to believe we missed that. Now, maybe it's just the way we think culturally. Maybe Italians think more in a constructivist way. But Gaetano and Leotti really elaborated on this constructivist approach, which seems consonant and consistent with the Italian way of thinking. Next. Now, one of the areas of concern, we want to look at 4 elements. The first we call genotype, which is the individual's genetic heritage. The second we label phenotype, and the phenotype is how the individual appears to the world. A third area of concern is what I call sociotype. And the sociotype is the individual's social experience and social context. Now, the fourth type is something more specific to CBT, what we call schema type. And the schema type really is based on the individual's beliefs. The idea that we want to look at the rules, the ideas that an individual develops over time. So a key ingredient in the cognitive behavioral formulation is really examining the individual schema, looking at the way they see the world. So the schema are a filter, and we understand our world through this schematic filter. Now, there are many different general types of schema that the major source of these schema is the family. We learn family rules. A second element is our culture. What are the cultural rules of our environment? What are the religious schema? What are the rules that we learn from religion? Some schema are gender related, more commonly found in men or women. But what we want to do is we want to examine the individual's rules, the way that they learn about their world. Next. So both CBT and psychoanalysis are information processing models. So what we want to do is examine the individual's life construct, what they know based on their life experience. And by life experience, I mean both their internal world and their external world. Everything gets filtered. The American psychoanalyst, go back one.
Yes.
The American psychoanalyst, Albert Ellis, and I call him a psychoanalyst because that was his original training. Ellis was trained in the tradition of Karen Horney, that we construct our understanding of the world. So Ellis would quote the Stoic philosophers, especially Epictetus. Men are not troubled by things, but by their view of them. So I may view a situation in a particular way. You may view that exact same situation from a different perspective, that you will view it as you construct it based on your experience. Next. A key part of the cognitive behavioral technique is the Socratic dialogue, meaning rather than telling the patient something, we help the patient to explore their feelings, their thoughts, and behaviors. How do they see the world? How does their understanding of the world influence how they feel? And how does this interact with what they then do, how they behave? So we want to look at three major elements. We want to guide the patient, a technique we call guided association, very much the use of questioning. And while we've been taught that questions need to be open-ended, what I am going to recommend is that questions are closed-ended, that the questions we ask help reduce withdrawal and avoidance. Now, you might ask, what kind of questions do we ask? Well, there are many kinds of questions. And probably the best way for choosing questions is similar to what we do in academic examinations. For example, some questions require a short answer. For example, does that experience frighten you? Yes or no? That you see the world in particular ways, true or false? Now, some questions require a longer answer. How did you deal with that situation? Sometimes the patient will say, I don't know. But in fact, they do know. And they may be reluctant to share their thinking because they once again construct a reality that influences how they think. So what I do in situations like this is I give the patient multiple choice. Is it this, this, or this? Are you reluctant to share with me what you were thinking? Might be yes or no. Are you reluctant to share with me because you're afraid I'll think less of you? Do you think I'll think something is wrong with you? Do you think you'll lose my respect? So I want to give the patient a choice of ideas. Now, some responses require just fill in the blank. So when you experience this, you end up feeling how? Now, some questions are essay questions. Tell me about what it was like growing up in your home. What was it like living with your father's anger? Some of the questions are more important than others, and we want to rank by severity. What is the most severe experience you had? Sometimes it's by importance. How important was this as you were growing up? Or how frequently do you have this experience? You'll excuse me, this is grappa. No. But my voice is dry, so it is tea. So the Socratic dialogue is to lead the patient, to guide the patient. That a typical psychoanalytic technique is, of course, free association. And free association has its value. But what we want to do is not only free associate, but really test out ideas, help the patient develop their own answers. Next slide. So we get to the issue of schema. Again, schema are the basic rules we live by. That there is no one schema. That there are themes. Certain schema emerge. So if we look at my area of special interest, personality disorders, what we see is that each of the personality disorders reflects the individual's schema. And we're defined by our schema. Now, once again, how we interpret it. So let me share some of my schema. I'm a middle child. I have an older brother and a younger sister. So one of the schema that I developed is that it's important to be noticed. Because as a middle child, you often get lost. So one of the things I was told, and I don't remember it, of course, is that I spoke very early. And if my parents had guest friends over to our home, even though I was a little boy, my father would take me from my bed and bring me in to meet their friends. And he would say, Arthur, talk to the people. And their friends would say, oh, he can't speak yet, he's just a baby. And I would say, I'm no baby, I talk good. And people would reward me for that. People would reward me for speaking. I had a grandmother who used to enjoy my speaking. She used to say, "Arthur, make a speech." And I could speak about anything I wanted. She just wanted to hear me speak. When I was a child in school, the idea I want to be noticed got me into trouble because the teachers were not pleased that I always spoke up, that I got noticed. And I recall one teacher saying to me that I had to learn to sit quietly, that speaking up would get me into trouble. And in fact, it often did. Now, one of the things that occurred in my life was that my father died when I was 9 years old. And I lost a major support for speaking. And what I discovered was that the teacher would call my mother into school. And they said, "We're worried about Arthur. He used to speak up all the time, and now he just sits quietly." Well, we might guess that I was depressed. My father died. But I soon regained my interest in being noticed. That I learned I could get more notice by being active than being quiet and passive. So when I was at a conference that we had in Romania, they had invited me to speak. And I said, "Will there be people there?" And they said, "See." I said, "Can I stand in front of the room and get noticed?" And they said, "Yes, of course." I said, "Then I'll do it." When my friend Giovanni asked me, would I be willing to give a lecture as part of this excellent series, I said the same thing. "Will there be people there?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Will I get noticed?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Then of course I'll do it." So being noticed is an important part of my life because I retired after 52 years of university teaching. Now, what's nice about teaching is you always get noticed, or at least you're hoping you're getting noticed. So it's a key part of my life experience, my work life, my family life. It's important to be noticed. Next. So we use the term schema to describe how we classify and catalog our reactions to various stimuli. And three major parts of the normal life experience are attachment, individuation, and loss. These are normal, as we're discovering through this horrible pandemic. That we lose people, that the virus creates situations of loss. So we can learn to understand schema in terms of the various combinations of how we learn to connect to people, attachment, how we learn to separate, individuation, and how we deal with loss. So let me stop for a moment and ask if there are any questions up to this point. Do you have any questions on the chat? Can we see questions? No?
No, at the moment, there are no questions.
Okay, next. Next slide. So the first thing I want to do is identify the schema. Where do they come from? The earlier a schema has been acquired, the more powerful. Who was the source of the schema? And we find that most schema come from the home environment. So something coming from a very powerful person, a parent, teacher, priest, that are learned very early are really harder to change. So what we want to avoid is challenging the schema. What we want to avoid is putting the schema under a microscope. The schema have a value and purpose. And we want to understand from each individual what the schema means to them and the purpose of the schema. How the schema help us through life, and in fact, how the schema get in our way. So schema can be positive or negative. And that may depend on our life circumstance. So, as I pointed out, as a young child in school, the schema, it's important to be noticed, got me into trouble. As I became older and advanced in school, my speaking out, my being more active in class, was valued. That teachers liked the student who was active and involved. So the value of the schema really is important to recognize. How does it help us and how does it hurt us? And a particular schema can be both. Now, when we challenge a schema, the schema must be looked at as a safety zone. That when we operate within our schema, we're more comfortable. So some schema are very broad. Some schema are very general. Now, the more narrow a schema, the more restricted we are. So it's important as a goal of therapy to broaden the schema. Anything outside of our schema really creates anxiety. We may not even know what to do with that energy. And I use the term energy very much as a psychoanalyst would, whether we call it libido, that basically, how does the individual operate within their schema? As we get to the limits of our schema, we become less and less comfortable. Next slide. Next slide. So the schema are the safety zones. The schema allow us to keep our balance. The schema are how we define ourselves. And here we have that constructivist perspective. So when a schema is challenged or threatened, I will perceive danger. If I say to myself, the world is a dangerous place, if I see the world as terribly dangerous, I will likely use avoidance or escape. I want to reduce the danger. So very often, what we find patients doing is being resistant to change. And they're resistant to change because they fear that something terrible will happen. So we want to approach a schema gently. We don't want to challenge it. We don't want to threaten it. We don't want to increase the patient's perception that something terrible will happen. For example, I have a patient who is phobic about driving on the highway. She will take an extra hour to drive somewhere, but only if she uses smaller roads. So the basic idea is driving on the highway is dangerous. And then I question the patient, and it's dangerous because, well, because cars are going at high speed. And that puts me at greater risk. So my question then is, what is the risk versus your resource? If you have an extra hour, then it's not a problem. That if you don't have the time, it becomes a major issue and a major problem for the individual. So what we want to do is help the patient reduce their perception of danger. Next slide. So we use the schema as a filter. Some schema are very active and they govern our behavior, often on a daily basis. Dormant schema arise when we're under stress. When we're under stress. When the stressor is removed, the dormant schema may return to their inactive state. So I want to identify with the patient what are the rules they live by. What are their active schemas? If I believe the world is a dangerous place, then I may be phobic. I may be avoidant. If I say the world is dangerous, but I can deal with it, we experience less danger and less anxiety. So I might do something under stress that I wouldn't ordinarily do. Why? Well, because I say I can deal with that. I have the resources necessary to effectively cope. So here again, we have an equation. What is the ratio of perceived, keep in mind the word perceived risk, and our perceived resources? What do I see as my strengths? What do I see as what I can bring to bear on a situation? Keep in mind that there is some schema that we operate under that we label unconscious, but they're there nevertheless. So we need to understand the nature of the schema. Next. What I want to learn is the learning. What have I learned from my early experience? That most schema are in place very early. Most schema are in place by middle childhood, so that we may go back to look at the genotype, the individual's temperament, the behavioral manifestation, phenotype, the environmental context, and the schema type. So we want to look at all four elements. What's the biological basis? How does it show itself? What is the environmental context? And what are the demands of the schema? Any questions up to this point?
Yes, there is a question about change, the change of the schema. There is the change which creates anxiety, as you told in the last slide, but there is also the change pursued by therapy. It's a different change.
Here again, we want to look at an idea that Beck used that he calls the continuity hypothesis. It's not change or no change. It's not a yes or a no. But there are levels of change. That's an excellent question. So I may be motivated to make a great change, but I may be not terribly motivated to make a big change. So we go not from, if we think of a scale from 0 to 10, 0, no change at all, 10, totally different. It's important to identify how much change is reasonable to make. Can I totally change who I am? Not likely. That the therapy experience works at building, and here's our key word, greater adaptability. That we want to get the patient who's very minimally motivated from a 1 to a 2, and then from a 2 to a 3. And maybe the most change that this patient can develop would be to get to a 3 or a 4, because there are external forces that work against change, which we call resistance. If I think to myself, change is dangerous, I'm not used to being different, then I'm reluctant to make changes. So the therapist works with the patient to slowly increase their goal-oriented behavior. Does that answer the question?
There are no other questions. I think we...
Okay. Next slide. Yes, Giovanni, you want to say something? No? Okay.
No, please go on. I want to arrive to the psychodynamic roots of CBT, but we are almost there. Please go on.
Now, we may have beliefs that they say to us, if you continue this behavior, we'll kill you. And there are people who say, well, then you'll have to kill me. But I'm not changing. I'm not even modifying my beliefs. So when the beliefs are strongly maintained, we may call the person a patriot or a martyr. They'll die rather than surrender their beliefs. Despite the evidence, we call them resistant. We say that there's something wrong with them, that they won't change what they believe. And we know that these beliefs were learned very early in life from very important and credible people. Next. So if we look at Freud's metapsychology, he talked about the id. The id is basically unconscious and hard to identify. But the basic schema, the id, is I want what I want when I want. So the basic theme for the id is I want my demands met. Now, if we go to the superego, the basic theme of the superego schema there are rules and social norms that we must follow. You cannot break the rules. The theme of the ego is how do I meet the demands of the id without breaking the rules of the superego? So we look at the theme. What are your demands? I want this. Now, if I say, it's important to be noticed, and I go to a funeral, who is the featured person at a funeral? Well, the dead person. But if I walk in and say, hey, everybody, notice me, I may get a lot of negative reaction, which I want to avoid. So how do I get noticed? I can get noticed in this situation by being very kind and very understanding and offer consolation. And people will say, oh, Arthur is so kind and understanding. Now, maybe I'm not that way. Maybe I'm rather shallow. But I know what the rules are. Example, I have 3 sons. The older 2 boys went to public school. But because of his birth date, my youngest son could not start school. So we made a choice to put him into a private school which was a private boys' school. And every day when the boys would leave school, they would have to go to a teacher, and my son would say, "Good afternoon. My name is Aaron. Have a good day." And the teacher would say, "Aaron, no, look at me. Have a good, Aaron, pay attention. You're a little kid. Look at me. Have a good day." "Good, thank you. You have a good day also." Now, what's interesting is when I'm somewhere with my three sons, um, my eldest son, I introduce him. I say, "This is my friend and colleague, Giovanni." And he'll say, "Hello." My second son will say, "Hello." And my youngest son will say, "Hello, my name is Aaron. Very nice to meet you." He's far more social, but he learned to be that way. Now, my eldest son works with computers. He's focused on the screen. My middle son works as a manager, but he's always been the kid who takes charge. My youngest son, Aaron, named for my mentor, Aaron Beck, owns his own business, and people come to him because he's so social. So basically, he has acquired basic social rules, requirements of our culture. It's important to be social. Okay, next slide. So I want what I want, what I wanted. How can I get what I want? And what are the rules of my family, my culture, my society, my peers? And we have to understand that many of the rules we have are gender related. For example, I was seeing a couple. He was a physician and she worked as his nurse. And they were in session and she says, "Oh, ow, I have this pain in my back." And he said to her, "When we're finished with the session, we'll go to the office and I'll give you an injection." And she started crying. And he just looked at her and he said, "Why are you crying?" She said, "Because you're not understanding." And he said, "Well, I said I would give you an injection." But what is it she wanted? She wanted his understanding, that he understood that she was in pain. But the basic rule for men is Men are supposed to take charge. Men are supposed to be the ones that take over and run things. Women look more to the emotional. So basically, what we learn in terms of gender is some rules are hard to change. So one of the things I learned from that couple was that when my wife is upset or in pain, I ask not what can I do, but how can I help? What would you like me to say or do that would be helpful to you? And that has been very important in our relationship. For me to put aside my masculine, let me take charge in favor of how do you feel? What can I say or do that would help you? Any questions up to this point?
Yes, there was a question about if schema are adaptive,
And where do you want me to go?
how can they become dysfunctional? A possible answer is the psychodynamic explanation. There are schema which are not adaptive, so the superego or id. But what do you think about this question? How is possible that schema can become not non-adaptive from a cognitive viewpoint?
Well, if I learn that anger is dangerous, then I may avoid anger. Other times, anger may be very useful. So we want to look at, adaptive versus non-adaptive schema. Sometimes the same schema can be very effective and help us, while at another time, that schema gets in our way. So, for example, I had been diagnosed with the coronavirus, and I was hospitalized for 11 days in isolation. The room was totally isolated. Everybody who came in was wearing double gowns and protective gear. And after 11 days, they said, well, you could go home now. And I stayed at home and then was reevaluated. They said that I was negative for the virus. So that was good news. But I followed the basic rules. I stayed home. I ate. I did what I needed to do. I took medicine. So I followed rules. Now, sometimes I question the rules. Why do I need to do this? How will this be helpful for me? So schema really have to fit the situation. Sometimes the schema work, and need a very small change to be adapted. Sometimes the schema have to be a much greater change. Does that answer that question?
No, there are no other questions.
Okay, next slide. Now, how do we get information about the schema? Well, self-report. We can observe the patient. We get a report of significant others. We can infer from verbalization. Let me give you an example. My university office is very typical office furniture. It's not what I would have in my private office, but this is what the university provides. Had a patient come in to my office at the university, and he looked around, and he said to me, "For what I am paying you, I would expect nicer furniture." Now, what can we infer from his words and actions? Well, we might infer that he has expectations of what I'm supposed to do or I'm supposed to be. That immediately he wants to set up a situation of who's in charge, who is more important. So he tells me, well, you know, his office is beautifully furnished. So he sets up the potential for conflict immediately in the therapy, in the very first session. We can look at evaluation by other professionals. What is the reason for the referral? What is the patient's history? Now, a separate issue is what I call the critical incident technique. And while many patients have the need to speak at great length about the difficulty, my question for the patient is, it would really be helpful if you could share with me a single experience, a single incident that shows what your life was like. Not a long story, but tell me a single incident that has influenced your life. So we can get information about schema in a number of different ways. Next slide. Next slide. So CBT has its roots in psychodynamic therapy, behavior therapy, and family systems. What's interesting, there's a book called The Handbook of Attachment, and it's in its third edition, 700 pages, 40 chapters, and in 700 pages, that's in double column, there's a single sentence that refers to CBT. So what is essential for us is to include an understanding of Bowlby's work in understanding the development of schema and the development of most psychological disorders. That some disorders are very obvious, that ideas about danger in the world. The world is a dangerous place. We see anxiety disorders. When we see themes of hopelessness, we see it as related to suicide. So basically, what we want to do is include a study of attachment theory as it has influenced CBT. Next slide. So,
Arthur, do you want to have a short stop? 10 minutes of.
I'm okay. Do you want to take a break, Giovanni?
If you want to have a short stop, otherwise.
All right, but we'll take a break.
A break, yes.
But wait. It's got to be 5 minutes.
Yes, just 5 minutes.
Now, not an Italian 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay.
Take a break.
Okay, just 5 minutes. Okay, just have a break of 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, we start again with this part on attachment, etc. Okay. See you in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Right, he had open heart surgery. He's okay. He just called, we call him back. He was pains in his chest. They were going to put in another stent, and then they said, no, don't do that. They broke open his chest, and he said he feels pretty good. It's 2 weeks. He's walking around. And I had such a fight, almost.
I heard him.
I'm so sorry. With the fucking Asian doctor.
They can still hear me. They can still hear me.
I don't understand. Anyway, you're having a procedure on Tuesday. That's enough.
Thank you.
What's wrong with him? His stomach is he breathing? Yes, or would it be? I called him yesterday. I left you alone, Mr. I can't see you for a month. I said, so what you call me back for? And you thought it was an emergency? And you can't see me for a month? What would you like me to do now? Let me call Dr. Wiley, and I'll get somebody else. I'm hanging up on you. No, I'll give you someone. Oh, why didn't you say that in the first place?
So they're going to do the,
Yeah, fingerprints on Monday. It's so ridiculous. Sorry, I was yelling. I didn't mean to. Did I bother you, huh?
mhm, let's see. It just needed about 4 packs of Splenda.
Oh. Right. Well, who's the
No. I always put Splenda in.
Oh.
I didn't.
I called my name. You stay here, not breathing. Yes. And you,
Okay. Are we ready to go back to work? Giovanni, are you there? We can hear you. Okay. Welcome back.
Okay, let's go on.
Okay. The ideas, first attachment. We learn to connect with others. We learn to relate to others through the early contacts at home. So what I want to look at is, and here's an important word for us, skills. What are your relationship building skills? Now, we may find that simply in the way the patient relates to us. How does the patient relate to us as therapists? And we start to build this pretty much from birth on. That what is the connection between the initial caretakers, and usually that means mother, for feeding, for warmth and for comfort. So what are the schema that I've learned to relate to people? Well, even in the context of this electronic communication, I learn to ask questions. So I stop and say, are there any questions? Because I want to make sure that I'm connecting with people. That if they have questions or concerns or challenges, that I want to find out what they are. What basic ideas do you have about relating? And as we get older and we develop additional social skills, the question that we ask schematically is, how do I learn to be a separate person? How do I learn to be an individual? We develop language, we develop behavioral skills, we broaden our emotional perspective. And we learn to modify schema that may deal with loss. So loss through divorce, loss through growing up, going from one school to another, the loss through death. So schema building and understanding schema style serves as a bridge between the psychodynamic and the cognitive behavior. What are the connections? Next slide. How do we learn to love? How do we learn to establish a connection and then maintain that connection? What are the relationship building skills? And again, I use that word again and again, that many of the patients we see are skill deficient. When we look at Linehan's work with borderline patients, what she focuses on is skill building, how to deal with emotional regulation. How do I regulate my reaction? How do I modify that? How do I change what I do? Separation. How do you take your place related to others, but separate from them? How do I learn to develop as a person within a family context, a cultural context? That it's very interesting, as I've had the opportunity, and I've been very fortunate to lecture in a number of different countries and to experience a number of different cultures, that, you know, I learn that people are different. For example, I was lecturing in Italy. I was in Catania. I was in Catania, and I asked for a nice restaurant. So my wife and I were sent to this restaurant, and we came in, and the waiter in the restaurant was the owner's son, a teenager. And he said in English, "What would you like to eat?" I said, "Gee, I'm not sure." And at that point, he goes to the kitchen and he brings out Mama. And she said, "What would you like to have to eat?" And I said, "What do you recommend?" And she said, "I recommend everything." So she brought us soup, salad, pasta, and meat. And this was a wonderful meal. The portions were perfect. The food was fresh and hot. And then we finished the meal, and I said, "How much is the bill?" And she said, "Oh," and she gave us a number. And I said, "No, it must be more than that." And she said to me, "Did you enjoy the meal?" I said, "It was delicious. It was wonderful." And she said, "That's enough. Then I'm happy." And what I've learned is about Italian culture. The idea that food is important, food is a place for sharing, food is a place for understanding each other. Not in big, big portions, but in small portions. It was delicious. So I learned about attachment. The idea of loss has to do with our circumstance. What is our life like when we have lost someone through death or through divorce? But basically, what do we learn to do to deal with the consequences of losing members of one system? To move on from one home to another circumstance. Any questions up to this point?
No, there are no questions at the moment.
Let's move on to the next slide. Next slide. So I want to gain clarity of the person's behavioral style. How did they act in various situations? And then we go back to the critical incident. What is the cognitive content of what they experience? In other words, what are they thinking about? That the duration of their response, when they have an experience, how long does it last? What are the targets of their response? So we want to examine a developmental perspective. Next slide. We want to do the same to evaluate their separation skills. How do they learn to separate from others? Is their separation limited by time? Is separation reactive? Is their separation emotionally based? Is their separation anger based? Next slide. And the same for looking at loss, looking at a developmental perspective. Next slide. When we're dealing with loss, some loss is complicated, some loss is more obvious. Some individuals focus on the loss and they exclude almost everything else so that their focus, maybe for their whole life, is on loss. What do I need to do? Well, be sorrowful. Maybe you need to spend your time with concrete reminders of the loved one, to build a shrine, to spend your time longing for the lost object, as in divorce. My wife left me. My husband left me. So the question is, what do I do about that? Now, I could spend my time focused on what I've lost. But the key word for us is, what am I going to do about it? Can a loss be replaced? Can I accept the loss? Or do I spend my life with high levels of emotion regarding the loss? Next slide. Now, one of the ways to look at a developmental perspective, rather than try to invent the wheel, I've used the work of the ego analyst, Erik Erikson, who, along with Heinz Hartmann, Anna Freud, and others, focused on the ego. And we can use that as a way of understanding schema. So in Erikson's model, he said, life is a series of understandings. We build, for example, the first crisis of life, and Erikson's model is a crisis model, is trust versus mistrust. What can I learn from my early attachment experience? Can I trust that I'll be kept warm? Can I trust that I'll be fed? Can I trust that I'll be comforted? Can I trust that I'll be kept physically close? Or do I learn the world cannot be trusted? So the basic scheme is trust, and the theme is hope. So when you're dealing with a suicidal patient, the developmental issue is a lack of hope, hopelessness. How do we help the patient be more trusting? And this very much is part of the therapeutic relationship. Having developed trust, ideally, the crisis, Erickson says, is building autonomy, individuation. And this is the development of courage and willfulness. How do I develop a sense of will? This is something I need to do. That we develop and put ourselves within the family dynamic. And this is followed by the crisis of developing purpose. What is your goal in that behavior? So here again, we have the idea of goal orientation. And what I ask the patient is, what is the purpose? What's the value of this behavior? In what way is the behavior adapted? What happens then is we begin to build a sense of what Erickson called industry. The basic idea that we build skills. In tribal societies, the skill might be young boys learning to hunt, for girls learning to care for the home and children. In more complex societies, industry will relate to building basic technical skills. How do I learn to do things? Well, coming to webinars. We follow this by developing an identity. Who am I? Who am I within my cultural context? We build this in terms of generativity, developing a sense of love. Once I know who I am, I'm better able to learn to be close. So what we need to do with this patient is help them learn intimacy building skills. How can I say or do something that will be pleasurable to you? How can I say or do something that will be helpful to you? How can I say or do something that will make your life better. And this is followed by generativity, learning to care for others. And this specifically is a skill we learn as therapists. How do we care for others? How do we do for others? And finally, what we want to do is view our lives. How have I contributed? If I evaluate my life, what have I learned? What have I given to others? Now, I'm 70, how old am I? I'm 78 years old. Now, will I live forever? No. Will there be an end for me? Yes. But will I die? And the answer is no. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense. What I give to you today, hopefully you'll use. And you'll take my words and pass them on to your students and to your patients. So what I'm sharing with you are things I've learned from my personal therapy, from understanding my schema, and from developing the basic schema. So we can look at the schema development developmentally. Any questions on this?
No questions.
Okay, next slide. Now, we know that change can be difficult, and there's resistance to change. Next slide. And we can look at the reasons the patient gives us for not changing. I shouldn't have to work at this. I don't want to work at changing. Or it may be more conflictual. No one can force me to change because change is frustrating. And one of my basic schema is I should not be frustrated. Change may be painful because frustration is difficult. And besides, if I change, it won't make a difference. Maybe everybody else should change. For example, I had a patient who was saying change is intolerant. I don't want to change. So I said, let's suppose I have a magic wand and I can make any changes you want. What would you want me to change for you? And he thought, he said, I want you to make everyone see things my way. So he didn't think about changing himself. What he was interested in was changing the rest of the world. For some people, they say, life is terrible, but it's gotten me this far. So I'll just keep doing it this way. So the question I ask the patient is, what gets in the way of your changing? What would you need to do to be just a very small bit different? And then I ask the key question, what's the purpose for you of not changing? What does not changing have as a value? And we explore that through the Socratic dialogue. Next slide. We developed a stage of change model that is different from the Prochaska di Clementi model. We see a series of steps. The first step in terms of changing is the patient says, what? I have to change? Or they may be anti-contemplative. I'm not going to change. And no one can force me to change. And to this I agree. How can we build value in being different? We want to lead the patient to the point of considering that maybe it may be worth thinking about change, but only maybe. No commitment. So we move to contemplation. I need to think about what I'm doing. And then we get to action planning. How do I make a plan to change? How do I implement that plan? Now, the thinking part is maybe you need redirection, and that becomes the goal of therapy. That we change what we do. For example, when I would come into my office in the morning at the university, I would stop along the way and say, good morning, how are you today, good morning. And I'm friendly because that's a basic rule. It's important to be friendly. Even if I don't feel friendly, but I know it's a basic rule. But what if I start coming into my office and not say anything to anybody? Just go right into my office, don't say good morning to anybody. What do you think might happen? Well, people might say to me, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Why do you ask? Well, you seem different. And people may notice that difference. so I can change the way I behave, that I can find some value in acting differently. And relapse is when we go back to our old way of thinking and acting. And then we reach a point of maintenance. Let me stick with what I've gained. So what I want to do as part of my basic assessment is, where are you, the patient, on a readiness to change? What would it take to help you to change? What would you need to do differently to change? And we want to look at that. What are the goals and purposes of change? Next slide. Now, the lack of motivation to change may be an example of some early learned survival mechanism, that staying the same helps me survive. Changing may put me in a path of potential failure, so that we can view resistance as an escape mechanism for survival. So for some patients, the resistance is adaptive. And we have to view it not as negative, but to understand the resistance and to join the resistance. Yes, I can understand why that is difficult. I can understand why you'd want to avoid that. Next slide. Very often patients, you say, what keeps you from changing? And they say, oh, it's unconscious. They've learned that magic word, unconscious, which means it's outside of their control. And besides, it's too late or too little. The fact that we view others as keeping us down. Or if I change, it'll give these other people, whoever they are, satisfaction. And I'm not going to give them that satisfaction. For example, I had a patient who said that she was thinking about suicide. And I asked her what she thought was appealing about suicide. And she said, well, I can picture my parents at the funeral and how bad they would feel. And I asked her, I said, when you graduated from school, did they come to your graduation? And she said, no. I said, then why do you think they'll come to your funeral? And she said to me, you're a bastard. You took that away from me. And I don't want to give them any satisfaction. But for some of us, we've learned that our present behavior gets us what we want. So if Giovanni invites me back, I will, of course, say yes, because my present behavior is worthwhile to me. Next slide. Now, a question was asked earlier about schematic shift potential. And again, I see it on a continuum, that some schema are parallel. Nothing will bring about change. That they view themselves as stuck. Nothing will change. My schema are petrified. Some schema are more dogmatic and very rigid. So change may come, but at a cost. For most of us, our schema are steady, meaning we learn, often through therapy, that the internal rules are clear and predictable. What are the demands of the superego? And we learn to be creative. That schema can be flexible. That a single schema can be adaptive or maladaptive, but we can bend the rules a little bit. And we call that artistic. Taking old rules and using them in new ways. But for some individuals, their schema are unstable and chaotic. And the rules shift and change, often without warning, out of our control. Emotional instability. So what we want to do with this patient is identify the rules and what is going to get in their way. How are the rules adaptive or maladaptive? Next one.
I think the time is, I think we can end this section about modifying schema, but then we have to, the time is, the lecture is concluded.
Okay. Well, what I will do, Giovanni, is I will send you have the slides.
Yes.
So anybody who wants the slides can contact you directly.
Yes, yes.
So since
yes, I show the address for the slides at the end again. Now we are okay.
So we're timed out. I want to thank you for inviting me to Sigmund Freud University to visit Milano, even though technically, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It has been my pleasure to be able to do that, and thank you for the opportunity to learn about Italian psychoanalysis. Thank you for this invitation. So we end here?
Yes, do you want to to end this section, the last 2 or 3 slides, if you want.
You want the revising?
No, otherwise, wait, yes, we can end here. Okay. I want to thank Professor Arthur Freeman that just had we know the coronavirus. It was I think, a very hard experience. But now you look better.
Molto grazie. So again, thank you.
Thank you. So
goodbye.
Bye. So I end this lecture and I stop and I greet everybody and see you for the next lecture of this series. Thank you and bye.
Bye-bye.
Ringrazio tutti quelli che ancora sono presenti. Come vedete, forse il professor Freeman era un po' affaticato da comunque avuto il corona poche settimane fa. C'è stato un momento in cui il coronavirus l'ha ridotto un po' male. C'è stato un momento in cui era diventato addirittura sordo e non si alzava più dal letto. Per fortuna adesso sta meglio. Dico 2 parole finali. Ha fatto più un parallelo tra alcuni aspetti cognitivi dinamici, meno approfondito le ragioni storiche di questa somiglianza. Comunque pubblicheremo presto un libro in cui sono approfonditi questi aspetti sia storici che concettuali. Cioè, questo stesso capitolo di Freeman, di lezioni Freeman, sarà pubblicato nel libro insieme ai nostri capitoli. Si tratta di un libro sulla formulazione del caso. Verrà pubblicato in inglese da Springer e poi in italiano da Cortina nel 2021. Quindi questa stessa lezione la troverete all'interno del libro pubblicata in italiano. Un saluto a tutti e ci vediamo alla prossima. La prossima lezione prevista in questa serie dovrebbe essere Peter Stormy, che ci parlerà del modello comportamentale, l'analisi funzionale nella formulazione del caso comportamentale. Un saluto a tutti.